Hello, friends. I want to share with you this book called The Peacegiver. It's by James L. Ferrell, Ferrell. Beautiful book about forgiveness. And just reading through it again has just helped me remember a lot about forgiveness, and I've been working on that to forgive people and to even repent to people and ask for forgiveness as well. Anyways, it's been an amazing journey, but so this book has so many truths in it that go along with the scriptures that I would like to share this book with you. So here we go. It's called the preface. Oh wait, the beginning part says how Christ offers to heal our hearts and homes. And I love that because he can definitely heal our hearts. And then when he heals our hearts, he's healing our homes as well. And everybody in the home can feel that. Okay, preface. We live in a world at war. I am referring not only to wars between countries, but also between former friends, siblings, spouses, parents, and children. Conflicts between countries are perhaps more dramatic, but the hot and cold wars that fester in the hearts of family members, neighbors, and friends bring more pain and suffering to this earth in a single day than have all the world's weapons since the beginning of time. If there ever is to be peace on earth, we first must find the way to peace in our hearts and homes. I am the way, the Lord declared. After your tribulation, I will feel after you. He promised, and if you harden not your hearts and stiffen not your necks against me, I will heal you. That's found in Doctrine and Covenants 112, section 112, verse 13. Nothing is more important than understanding not just that the Lord's atonement is the answer to our daily, painful predicaments, but how it is the answer. Let me read that again. Nothing is more important than understanding not just that the Lord's atonement is the answer to our daily, painful predicaments, but how it is the answer. This book is an account of how the Lord feels after us to heal us and what we must do to receive the peace of his healing. It is the story of a husband and wife whose marriage is in trouble. It could just as well be the story of a father and child who aren't speaking, or of neighbors who bristle at each encroachment over a property line. The Lord's atonement reaches deep into the trouble of daily life, to the very bottom of every dispute and hurt feeling. To the predicament of a hard heart, he offers the promise of a new one. To the pain of hurt feelings, he offers the balm of his love. To utter loneliness, he offers the companionship of the heavens. His birth was heralded by the words peace, goodwill toward men. And that can be found in Luke chapter 2, verse 14. Oh, do you need help? Help. Okay, here we go. Do you need the next one? This one's got all kinds of food. Do you want to see all the foodsies? Okay. Here you go. Get all the foodsies. You see all the foodsies? Okay. His birth was heralded by the words, peace, goodwill toward men, because his atonement is what makes peace and goodwill possible. Whether in a home or a bunker, the way to true, deep, lasting peace is only in and through the Prince of Peace. He is our peace, Paul declared. For through his atonement, he has broken down the middle wall of partition between us, having abolished in his flesh the enmity. And you can read that in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14 through 15. There are far too many partitions in our hearts and homes and too much enmity between us. But the carpenter of Nazareth has constructed for us peace. My desire is to explore with you how. Okay, so this is part 1, chapter 1, the gift of Abigail. A storm in the soul. That night, the night was cold in more ways than one, Outside, a heavy wind pounded thick raindrops against the windows. The eaves above Rick Carson's bed creaked, as they always did in such windstorms, and he could hear the lawn furniture scraping slowly along the patio, as if each chair were reaching out in a futile attempt to grab a handful of concrete. At times it felt as though the house's wooden frame was bending, a movement Rick supposed he could have measured if he had either the inkling or the instruments to do so. He felt himself leaning heavier into his bed, perhaps in his own futile attempt to keep the house anchored to its moorings, or in an equally futile attempt to moor himself to something solid. Behind him lay his wife of 12 years. They were hugging their respective edges of the queen bed, she facing the window and Rick the wall, careful not to touch each other. It had been 3 days since they had spoken a word to one another, except out of necessity, nearly as long as the rain had been pounding at their home. Rick lay awake, wondering what he had done to deserve this. Our marriage is a sham, he thought, despite what he considered to have been his best efforts. There is no tenderness, no understanding. He ached with despair. Things had been so bad with Carol for so long that Rick could barely remember the good times. You want to get out? There had been some. In fact, during the early years of their marriage, Rick had thought he was quite happy, and he had believed Carol to be as well. But the increasing unhappiness of the intervening years had called these early beliefs into question. Rick was no longer sure how happy he or Carol had ever been. His memories of the past and hopes for the future sagged under the weight of a depressing present. Despite the cloud of unhappiness he felt enveloping his marriage, Rick had until then done his best to minimize and deny the problems. He survived by employing a kind of inner diversionary trick, by pushing from his mind thoughts of Carol, his marriage, and the injustices. Do you want to go over? He survived by pushing from his mind his marriage and the injustices and pains that inhabited his inner chambers, and by concentrating on other things. Here, I'll help you get out. Come here. Oh, there we go. Yay, now you're out. 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 Good job. That inhabited his inner chambers, and by concentrating on other things. Everything will be okay if I can only hang on, he thought, as he did his best to put a happy face on their relationship. Carol will come around. But Carol hadn't come around, and their relationship was only deteriorating the more. As he lay there, Rick could sense something amiss in the patience he had been purporting to exercise. For the longer he exercised it, the more bitter and impatient he had become. He felt not unlike the drug addicts and alcoholics who assuage themselves with the naive lie that this hit or drink will be the last. His marriage was in trouble, and what frightened him most was that he wasn't sure he cared anymore. Over the last 5 or so years, he had shed many tears over the predicament he found himself in. One night, Carol had suggested that perhaps it would be better if he moved out for a while. The time apart might help us appreciate each other more, she had said, but her voice lacked conviction and rang hollow of hope. It was a voice Rick knew, for he heard it within himself as well. Rick remembered that terrible night as he now lay listening to the storm. When Carol suggested he leave, it was like hell itself opened wide its jaws to give Rick an immediate and threatening view of what he had wanted to keep himself from seeing. He began to shake uncontrollably, and tears that felt like they originated in the marrow of his bones gushed from his eyes. The tears, shudders, and cries came in torrents. Just as one spasm of heartbreak would seem to pass and his body would start to settle, a new wave would burst from deep within him, and his wailing would begin anew. He felt his hope for happiness, which he had clung to until that moment, slipping away with each teardrop. All the while, Rick recalled, Carol lay next to him, emotionless. She hadn't reached over to comfort him. As he lay in memory, Rick could still feel the echo of those shudders within him. Things had calmed a bit between himself and Carol over the past 18 months, but the bleak essentials of their relationship remained the same. He hadn't left as Carol had asked because, probably out of pity, she had withdrawn the suggestion, but her words still hung in the air between them. Perhaps we need to get away from each other. Maybe that will help. Rick knew better. With the indifference he was feeling within himself, he feared that he might like the time away from demands, expectations, criticisms, and the weight of Carol's unhappiness that pressed upon and accused him whenever they were together. Even worse, Rick was afraid Carol might like the time away as well, a risk with implications he couldn't bear to think about. The streetlight in front of their house cast enough glow through the storm and against the wall Rick was facing to illuminate the painting of the two of them that hung there. The artist had captured Carol perfectly, he thought, from the straight line in which she set her mouth to the determination in her jaw and the icy glare of her eye. Even the painter couldn't deny it, he thought to himself, feeling all the more discouraged. Why didn't I see it before we married? Chapter 2, Memories. Rick and Carol were both members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, as it was nicknamed by early antagonists. They had been married in one of the church's holy temples, this one in Los Angeles. Temples differ from ordinary church buildings in that they are set apart solely for the delivery of sacred ordinances pertaining to eternal families. The idea being that families can be sealed together as family units into the eternities, each family joined to the generations that preceded it until all of the worthy members of the human race are sealed up as the family of God. Rick and Carol had been taught from the earliest days that marriage in the temple by one with the priesthood authority to seal couples beyond death and into the eternities was the crowning ordinance of their faith and the single most important decision of their life, so they did not take marriage lightly. When they entered the temple that late spring day, they believed they were starting something that would last forever. Like many young men of his faith, Rick had served a mission for the church for 2 years, 2 years away from school, work, and dating, during which time he did nothing but teach people about his beliefs. He had been home from his mission for less than a year and was dealing with being dumped by his dream girl when he saw Carol for the first time. It was the first day of the new semester at UCLA. Rick was sitting against the far wall of the Institute classroom, a religious studies course for members of the Mormon faith, and for young Mormons, a great place to meet potential dating partners. When she walked in, looked around uncertainly, and took her seat on the other side of the room. She was tall, with dark brown, slightly wavy hair about shoulder length. Trim, athletic, and very pretty. Physically, she reminded Rick of Glenda, his ex-dream, and he looked at her almost in mourning. M-O-U-R, mourning. But as he stole glances in the new girl's direction, he saw something different in her. She seemed less assured of herself than Glenda had been. He could tell by the way her eyes darted to others in the room, as if wondering what they were thinking of her. Glenda would never have done that, he thought to himself. Believing that everyone was looking at her, she would have sat regally still, trophy-like, showing them what they had no hope of ever winning. Rick's eyes had lingered on the new girl as he thought of this, and she busted him, meeting his gaze with her own. He looked quickly away, forcing himself to focus on the instructor, whose words had been nothing but muffled background noise to that point. Still, he could see the girl out of the corner of his eye, and finally succumbed to the urge to again look in her direction. He resolved to find a way to meet her. She left too quickly for him to catch her that night, but Rick sat next to the door 2 nights later, right behind where she had sat on Tuesday. Sure enough, she walked in again alone, right before the class started, and sat in front of him. He didn't hear much of that lesson either. Can you wrap up? You're trying to reach your cars. He introduced himself after class. Her name was Carol Holly Adamson. She had grown up in Bakersfield, the fourth of an enormous brood of 13 children. She had returned that semester after 2 years off to work and save money for her school expenses. She was a 22-year-old sophomore. Her shyness, Rick discovered later, was due in part to the poverty in which she had been raised. She had lost considerable weight in the previous year and looked better than she was accustomed to looking. She was now a first-rate beauty without the attitude Rick had come to expect from many who looked as she did. He fell for her immediately. Their courtship had been lightning quick by LA standards. 6 months to engagement, another 3 to marriage. 11 months later, their first child, Alan, was born. Another child, Eric, came 3 years later, followed a few years after that by 2 girls born just 15 months apart, Annika, now 5, and Lauren, who was 3. The children had added some of the pounds back to Carol that she had lost before Rick had met her, and although at times he longed for the athletically trim girl from the Institute class, he still found her attractive, even with all the trouble they had been having. If there was a problem in the physical attraction department, it was that Carol found his thinning hair and increasing waistline unattractive. The sparks were long gone, and he resented her for it. The children were Rick's pride and joy. They were wonderful kids, if a little too prone to teasing, which Rick easily dismissed in light of his own childhood memories. "They're just kids," he had protested to Carol on a number of occasions when it seemed to Rick she was taking too hard of a line. "Ease up a little." But in Rick's view of things, she never eased up enough. She harped on the children the way she harped on him, especially the boys. "Clean this, empty that. You didn't do enough of this. Why don't you care about that? When will you start thinking of others?" And so on. No positive reinforcement, no grateful recognition, no thanks, just buckets of worries, insecurities, and complaints. Rick tried to spend frequent and quality time with the kids, partly to compensate for what he thought was Carol's lack of positive attention, and partly to bury himself in relationships of unquestioning love. "Every child deserves a dog," a friend had once told him, "because puppies love their child masters no matter what has happened at school." To Rick, his children were his puppies. They ran to him when he arrived home, begged him to play, and enjoyed resting in his arms. Their warm and buoyant affections kept him afloat. It also, however, ripped him apart. If they knew their parents' feelings, he thought, they wouldn't survive it. They'd be devastated and scarred for life. His heart ached for them. If not for the children and for the social ramifications of divorce, both familial and in the church, Rick was no longer confident he would still be married. He was teetering at the edge of an unthinkable abyss, an abyss with eternal implications and complications, and not just for him. The thoughts were too painful, so he did what he always did. He tried to think of other things, the way one of his friends foolishly tried to think of other things when he began to feel the spirit, in order not to cry. Rick closed his eyes and tried to force his way to sleep, an hour-long process or so, interrupted by frequent glances at the alarm clock to see how much time had passed. Finally, he gave up, rolled to his back, and began to think of one of his heroes, his Grandpa Carson. Grandpa Carson had been dead for 10 years, and his death had been very difficult for Rick. They had grown close through Rick's childhood and teenage years, as he often spent extended periods during the summer months with Grandpa and Grandma on the farm. Sometimes Rick's younger sister and brother would join them, but very often it was just Rick and his grandparents for days, and sometimes weeks at a time. During those periods, Grandpa taught him how to fish, how to golf, how to care for heroes, and perhaps more than anything, how to care for a wife. For Grandpa Carson was notorious in the family for being an impossibly difficult, or Grandma Carson was notorious in the family for being an impossibly difficult woman. She was the best grandmother anyone could ever hope for, doting over her grandkids and complimenting them from sunup to sundown, but she was a very different person toward Grandpa. It seemed he couldn't do anything right. It was always Dale this and Dale that. She put him down mercilessly. From his poor driving, even though she was the one who had backed over gas pumps on more than one occasion, to his few strands of hair that he combed proudly over his otherwise bald pate, to the way he had lied to a couple of robbers about money he said he wasn't carrying, a falsehood she quickly made the robbers aware of. She delivered most of her jabs with a smile, almost as if she were joking, but the sheer volume of her comments must have taken a terrible toll. Rick and the other grandchildren always marveled at the magnanimous way Grandpa reacted. He would wink to the nearest grandchild, and his eyes would twinkle as he drawled, "Oh, Grandma," in apparent mock protest. He didn't seem to take her seriously when she talked that way, playing her comments as if she were merely having fun, and giving the grandchildren the cue to read them the same way. After years together, it was almost like the two of them had perfected a stand-up comic routine, Grandpa playing Laurel to Grandma's Hardy. But Rick knew it wasn't quite that way, for he was seated between his grandparents during a ride back to the farm one warm summer evening when Grandpa lost his twinkle and forgot his wink. Rick was about 9 years old at the time. Grandma had been badgering Grandpa about something, and Grandpa suddenly lost his temper. "Oh, go to another place," he blurted in disgust. Rick sat stunned as they continued home in silence, for he had been raised to believe that swearing was taboo. He felt like the proverbial elephant in the middle of the room that no one dared acknowledge. When they arrived at the farm, Rick went straight to his room. From his bed, he listened to them argue about how Grandma treated Grandpa around the grandkids. The anger and argument didn't diminish his grandfather in Rick's eyes, but rather enlarged him, for he knew that Grandpa was hurt by Grandma's negative comments, but seemed to be able to love her all the same. And for the rest of his days, he never again lost his twinkle or forgot his wink, at least not in front of Rick. Over the past few years, Rick had thought often of his grandfather. More and more, he found himself feeling that he had married a younger version of his grandmother. He thought of Grandpa and his example of perseverance as a way to survive. At times, he had the feeling that his grandfather was watching him from wherever he was. This thought had often acted as a brake on Rick's worst impulses and helped him make the best of his unhappy situation. Somewhere in the middle of these thoughts, Rick drifted into the sleep he had been searching for. As he settled into slumber, his memories constructed themselves around him, and he found himself in his grandfather's farmhouse. Chapter 3, Marching to Carmel. Dinner was cooking, and the aroma of homemade chicken noodle soup, his grandmother's specialty, wafted through the air. Rick looked for his grandmother, but she was not around. He looked out the bay window and crossed the fishing pond to the pasture beyond. His grandfather Carson was standing in the middle of the pasture, a good 400 yards away, looking toward the house. Rick knew instinctively that he was waiting for Rick to join him. He eagerly sprang from the house and started down the dirt path to the fields below. The sights around Rick flooded him with memories: the pond just below the house where he had caught his first fish, the stream that drained from the pond and had been the site of many twig races between his cousins and him, the rolling mounds of the pasture that had created challenges when he was moving sprinkler pipe, but had enabled so much snowmobiling fun during the height of winter. This was Rick's favorite of all places, the open space and wonder of his childhood. "How's my golf partner?" his grandfather asked with familiar jocularity when Rick reached him. He was wearing his trademark golf shirt, khaki pants, and tennis shoes, his work clothes. These clothes were part of the family lore, both because he never seemed to change them or else had multiple pairs of the same outfit, and because for a rancher, he was remarkably ill-suited for hard labor. Much to Grandma Carson's chagrin, he invested heavily in hired hands and was usually the first to suggest an alternative to chores when his grandchildren were visiting. He retained his love for youthful adventures almost to his dying day. He looked as Rick remembered him, although without his usual glasses. "I'm fine, Grandpa," Rick lied. "How's Carol?" "Oh, she's fine too," he lied again, feeling a bit uneasy. Grandpa Carson looked deeply at Rick. "And the kids?" "Oh, they're great. You'd be real proud of them," Rick responded enthusiastically, grateful for a question he could answer honestly and with little effort. "Alan has a lot of you in him, Grandpa, right down to his distaste for hard labor," he added jokingly. Grandpa Carson smiled pleasantly, but did not burst into the ear-to-ear grin Rick remembered so fondly and had hoped to elicit. Grandpa Carson rested his eyes on Rick without saying a word, and Rick's discomfort grew. He felt compelled either to turn away or to speak over the unease he was feeling. "He and Eric are good young men," he blurted, choosing to do the latter. "Fun-loving but serious about serious things. Well, for preteens anyway." Grandpa Carson again nodded pleasantly, still saying nothing. "And the girls?" Rick exclaimed, over-talking the way one does when wishing to avoid other topics. "Annika and Lauren are little angels. They just make me smile." "Yes, Ricky," his grandfather interjected, "they make me smile too." "But you?" "Never knew them?" Grandpa Carson responded. Rick nodded sheepishly. Grandpa turned his hand and gazed off into the distance. He squinted ever so slightly, which creased his skin from the corners of his eyes to beyond his temples. To someone who didn't know him, this mild squint would seem merely an attempt to focus on a distant object, but Rick knew better. This, like the beaming smile Rick had hoped to see, was a look he recognized. His grandfather was focusing his thoughts more than his vision. Something was on his mind, and Rick was afraid he knew what it was. Do you remember the time we mowed the weeds on that little peninsula on the lower pond and made it into an island green? Grandpa Carson asked, nodding toward the lake in the southeast corner of the pasture. Oh, yeah, I remember, Rick chuckled, relieved by the question. It had taken them nearly all day to cut down the grass to the nubs and rig up a flagstick, a project they had embarked on instead of moving sprinkler pipe. Grandma wasn't very happy about it. Do you remember your hole-in-one that day? Did he ever? Rick had told the story so many times before with such pride that over the years he had forgotten to feel bad about the 3-foot diameter hole that counted as the cup. I'll never forget it, Grandpa. Do you remember how happy you were? Oh, yes, absolutely. I think I smiled for a solid week. Me too, Ricky, his grandfather agreed. That was a great time. He paused for a moment, remembering the day. Then he turned back to Rick. Are you that happy now, Ricky? Despite his foreboding worries that the conversation might turn this direction, the question caught Rick short. He wanted so badly to say yes, but the best he was able to do was an unconvincing, yeah, I think so. He dropped his eyes toward the ground, betraying all that his words had tried to keep hidden. I've been watching you, Ricky. I ask for reports as often as possible, and occasionally I'm even allowed to check in on you. You make me so proud, son. He often called Rick son, and Rick loved it when he did. You're a hard worker and a great father, but I know something of the struggles you are going through as well, both because I see them and because I've been through some of them myself. You've been in my prayers for years, and never more so than now. There are many who are praying for you, my boy. Rick stood in silence, halfway between embarrassment and gratitude. So Grandpa knows, he thought to himself resignedly. He knows. Rick cut the charade. I don't know what to do, he lamented. Things are pretty rough right now. To tell you the truth, I've done everything I can think of, but nothing helps. I know, Ricky. I know. But there are a few things you haven't thought of, and the most important of those will not be something you do, but will rather be something you allow to be done to you. What do you mean? His grandfather smiled. Come, I want to show you something. Suddenly, Rick found himself on the top of the range of hills that ran along the eastern border of the ranch. He and his grandfather were standing next to the enormous boulder that towered like a sentinel on the bald spot of the mountain, the very highest point on the range and the destination of many horseback rides during his youth. From that vantage point, looking westward, he could see the whole of the ranch, with its pastures, lakes, and forest. The farmhouse was a tiny dot, but he could see it, along with the pond in front. From this height, the roof of the barn was visible from behind the huge cottonwoods that normally shielded it from view. Far below, at the base of the hill, flowed the Squalum River, where Rick and his family had played so often, fishing, camping, and floating on inner tubes through the gentle rapids. Come, Ricky, his grandfather said, putting his arm around Rick's shoulder and turning him from the view of the ranch. I want you to see something. He walked Rick to the top of the bald spot to look out toward the east. You're going to see this. Somebody's having fun with the flag. To Rick's surprise, they looked down upon a vast desert wilderness. I never saw this before, he said. Has it always looked this way? But his grandfather didn't answer. Did I ever look to the east of the range? Rick asked himself. He couldn't remember. Oh, thank you. Hi. I see it. It is yours. Immediately below them spread a desert plain from his vantage point high on the mountain. Rick could see far in every direction. To the north, the plain rose gradually on the backs of rounded hills. Yay, you're a grand old flag, you're a high-flying flag, and forever in peace may you wave. To the north, the plain rose gradually on the backs of rounded hills. Southward, however, good, you're singing. Southward, however, the sands continued as far as the eye could see, with rugged peaks thrusting heavenward here and there in the far distance, 20 or so miles to the east. The plane fingered its way into a bleak and foreboding region of medium-height mountains. The fissures and cracks in the barren hills had made the whole area look like it had been baked in a kiln. Through a few of those cracks, Rick could see beyond the hills into a deep lake-filled valley that shimmered in the distance. Grandpa, has the land always looked like this? Rick tried again. And yes and no, Ricky, he answered. The land has looked like this for millennia, but no, you have never seen it from here before. I don't understand. Grandpa nodded but said nothing. He seemed to be waiting for something. Look, he said finally. David and his men approach. Rick squinted in the direction his grandfather was pointing toward the northeast. Far below on the desert plain, Rick could make out what appeared to be an area of scrub brush, but as he looked closer, he saw the brush was moving. David? He puzzled aloud, unsure who his grandfather was talking about. Yes, look. Rick suddenly found himself in the desert valley among a group of men, about 600 in number. Dust clung to their clothes, which for most of them consisted of a roughly hewn outer garment that reminded Rick of what he had seen offered by street vendors on trips to Tijuana. The robes were fastened around their waists with thick leather belts. Smaller, lighter pieces of cloth were draped over their heads and bound by a cord. These were close in collar and went to the undergarment that showed through rips and holes in their robes. Their beards were full and wild, their leathery faces and hands chafed and dry. Rick couldn't help thinking that their skin resembled the baked terrain he had witnessed moments before from the ridge. They looked like vagabonds from Old Testament days who had been living in the wilderness for years without the tempering influence either of civilization or of gentle women. Rick soon discovered this was precisely who they were. A party of 10 or so men approached the multitude and the crowd parted, allowing them to move into the center of the throng. There Rick saw a most magnificent-looking, strapping man. There was a dignity about him that set him apart both from the other men and from the terrain about him. It was obvious from their skin, clothing, and beard that he had been living this way at least as long as the others, but something was different about him, almost like his soul remained moist where others had long been parched. Rick then noticed that the man's clothing, while every bit as dusty and worn as that of the others, seemed to be made of finer material. Rich collars peeked through the dust. He belongs in other places, Rick thought to himself. Loftier places. This is not his home. The approaching party stopped before the man. David, son of Jesse, we have been to the house of Nabal, spoke the man in front. David, son of Jesse, thought Rick. He looked inquiringly at his grandfather. Yes, Ricky, he said, as though reading his mind. This is David, son of Jesse, future king of Israel. It is as you thought, my lord, said the spokesman, whose voice pulled Rick's attention back to the scene. Nabal's shearers have gathered their plenty back to Carmel, and they are making merry and feasting. The crowd of men who were now gathering around the party of 10 nodded their heads happily and smiled their baked lips in approval. But he denies that he knows you, my lord. He refused to recognize our service to his men and his property. He mocked us and rejected our request for provisions. We have returned with nothing. At this, the crowd erupted in anger. This is an outrage, shouted a man to Rick's right. He should pay for this, rejecting the son of Jesse, shouted another, shaking his fist angrily. The crowd howled their approval, and others began to shout for their incendiaries. They began to stir each other into a rage. What is going on here, Grandpa? Asked Rick. The 25th chapter of 1 Samuel, he said. Perhaps you have been golfing a little too much, he added, his eyes dancing playfully. David and this group of outcasts have been forced into the wilderness for survival, his grandfather continued. After David slew Goliath, his fame steadily climbed throughout the land. King Saul became insanely jealous of him and for years has been trying to kill him. David has lived the life of a vagabond, and these men, mostly fugitives from the law and outcasts from society, have gathered to him in the wilderness. We are now in the desert south of Judea, in an area known as the wilderness of Paran. The body of water you noticed in the distance a moment ago was the Dead Sea. While here, David and his men have been protecting the shepherds and flocks of a rich man named Nabal. Bedouin tribesmen frequent these parts, and without protection, many of Nabal's sheep would have been lost. David and his men could have fallen upon Nabal's flocks for their own sustenance, but they didn't. Neither did they take for themselves what the flocks and their handlers needed. Nabal's shearers have now gathered back to the Judean town of Carmel to Nabal's estate to shear and celebrate their plenty. And as you can see, David and his men remain here in need. Their provisions are running short. Despite this, despite all their help in enabling Nabal's plenty, he is refusing to help them? Rick asked indignantly. Yes. No wonder why they're outraged, Rick muttered. Rick turned back to the men, who were yelping and waving their fists in the air around David. Since the word from his men, David had stood still, his countenance fallen to the earth. Rick looked at him through the crowd. He had been stung by the report of Nabal's rebuff, to be sure, but appeared now to be regaining his composure. Rick could see the tension rising in his face as his men shouted around him. David's eyes narrowed and all at once seemed to fill with resolve. He flung his arm overhead, holding erect a long steel blade that glistened in the sunlight. Gird ye on, every man his sword, he shouted above the clamor. We are going to Carmel to pay our respects to a fool named Nabal. The men went wild. Okay, so you can find this part in the scriptures on 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 13. If you want to read some more about it. Okay. It's going to drip all over, buddy. I didn't turn that lid all the way on. Okay. The men went wild, and among those men Rick suddenly noticed a man who could have been his twin. He with the rest was cheering wildly, his sword in hand. Startled, Rick watched as David commanded a third of the men to stay with the meager provisions and then organized the remaining 400 or so, Rick's twin included, for a march to Carmel. As he watched, Rick suddenly understood that the man was not his twin, but himself. He was marching to Carmel with David. But why? He wondered, what am I doing in this dream? The procession headed north toward the hills, kicking up the dust of the desert floor. When the trail of dust finally disappeared around the rise of a hill, Rick turned to his grandfather. Why have you shown me this, Grandpa? He asked. Why are we here? And why did I see myself among David's men? Hold on just a second. Baby seems to be thirsty. Let me grab his water. Okay. All right. I'm trying to drink from Mama's water bottle. I'll give you yours. Here you go. There you go. That's yours. Do you see yours? Right here. That's yours. Okay. Okay, then that's the end of the chapter. All right.